Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this webinar. We'll be talking about an issue that is that investors still struggle with, which is energy transition. And we'll hear from experts from FFI Solutions who will enlighten us on what energy transition entails and why it issue matters to investors. My name is Gladys. I am the Communication and Admin Associate at the Intentional Endowment Network. And I'm going to just go over a few logistics before handing over to Christopher, who will present today's moderators of this wonderful panel. Very briefly before we dive in, for everyone who is new at the Intentional Endowment Network, we are a nonprofit collaborative peer learning network where endowment and experts come together to advance the field of investing for an equitable, low carbon, and regenerative economy. We do this through forums and events, peer learning networks, sharing useful resources on sustainable investing opportunities, and providing educational venues like this webinar. You can become a network member as an asset owner, an asset manager, or other stakeholder to keep this growing movement going. Or you can also join us for specific programming that is available for non-members. We're excited to announce you that our June milestone 2021 climate action pursuit is actually open for registration. For some of you who are not familiar with the climate action pursuit, it is a unique platform for advancing climate action together this year. Through a virtual convening, check out our website to see the agenda, participants, and join our flexible programming that will begin in June 10 to 11, sorry about that, in 2021. So the last thing from me here is just few logistics on this webinar. Participants in this webinar are muted for now, but you can ask questions or add comments using the comment or Q&A sections, and make sure you click on everyone if you want it to go to all recipients. So this webinar will be recorded and it will be distributed to all registrants, and it will also be available on our website if you want to go back to this conversation. With that being said, I will turn it over to Christopher, who will introduce himself and introduce us to this wonderful panel today. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you, Gladys. And usually only my mom calls me Christopher, but that's okay. So hello, everyone, and thanks for joining today for the webinar. And thank you to IEN for your sponsorship and for all the great work that you do within the endowment space. Again, my name is Chris Ito. I am the CEO of FFI Holdings. And if you can go to the next slide, please. And just before we get started, just some quick background on us. FFI is the parent of two operating companies, and both of those companies provide products and services to investors that facilitate their transition to more sustainable investing. FFI Solutions was originally founded as fossil-free indexes, and we're best known today for the Carbon Underground 200 exclusion list. And this is a list that's used by asset owners to divest from fossil fuels, and it's also licensed by asset managers for them to create fossil-free portfolios for their clients. And the list is currently being used to screen roughly over 8 billion in assets. And beyond exclusions, we're now providing the analytical tools and consulting services to help investors incorporate carbon risks and sustainability considerations into their broader investment decision-making process. The other entity that we formed more recently is FFI Advisors, which is an investment manager that's focused on creating and managing investment strategies around sustainability trends. And our flagship product is, in fact, a long-short strategy that's centered around the energy transition. Next slide, please. So our discussion today is going to focus primarily on the two main sectors that are impacted by the transition, which are fossil fuels and clean energy. And our panelists will give some observations about current trends in the sector, and then we'll talk about how investors are starting to modify portfolios as they seek to incorporate concepts like net zero portfolios. So then we'll pose some questions to the panelists and try to leave some time for Q&A. Next slide, please. So our presenters are a colleague of mine for FFI Solutions and two individuals that I've had the pleasure of working pretty closely with over the last few years. And I will introduce them in the order that they're going to be presenting. So first we have Henrik Jeppesen, who is the head of North American outreach for the Carbon Tracker initiative. And many of you are going to be familiar with Carbon Tracker. They're certainly one of the pioneers in the fossil fuel stranded asset theory, and their research has really been influential, I think, in bringing to light the visibility of those financial risks. So Henrik's going to talk about the carbon bubble and explain concepts like peak oil demand. And next up was supposed to be my colleague, Lynn Connolly. And Lynn is the director of research and has really been instrumental in maintaining the Carbon Underground 200. Lynn was going to talk about the coal sector, but she recently had her second shot of the COVID vaccine. And about an hour ago, she emailed us and said that she is down for the count with some bad side effects. So unfortunately, not only are we going to miss her expertise on coal, but it leaves us with an all-male panel, which is truly a shame, but I will say certainly unintentional. So next we're going to hear from Ron Pernick, and Ron is the founder and the managing director of Clean Edge, which is a clean energy research and index provider. So we ourselves are transitioning from the dirty to the clean. And Clean Edge is one of the most recognized clean energy indexers in the world, with over 4 billion in ETF assets that are tracking one of Ron's several indexes. And then finally, my colleague, Mike Palmieri, will talk about our experience with asset owners and share some insights that we've learned through our engagement with investors on energy transition issues. Mike's the CEO of FFI Solutions, and like me, he is a proud graduate of The Ohio State University. So before we, sorry, next slide, please. So before we get to the panelists, and just because so many of you are from the endowment community, I just wanted to show some recent headlines about sustainability commitments from certain endowments. Obviously, many of your institutions have made commitments to have their operations become carbon neutral. So it is really natural that the concept of carbon neutrality is now being applied to the management of endowment portfolios through mostly net zero objectives. And perhaps as much as this grieves me, and you could see the headline there on the slide, I should give a special shout out to the University of Michigan. And those of you who know me as a Buckeye, I would say that Michigan has, how would you characterize it, a certain special place in my heart. And but I do think that the net zero commitment that they made is really going to be influential for other particularly public universities in that region of the country. So hopefully that's going to be a catalyst for others to follow. So my kudos, my public kudos to what we affectionately call that school up north. So now next slide, please. And then I'm going to turn it over to Henrik, and he's going to start our discussion of fossil fuels and the carbon bubble.
Thank you so much, Chris. And also thank you to IEN for having us to talk today, and good morning, good afternoon to everyone. Just for those who are not 100% familiar with us, Carbon Tracker Initiative, we are an independent financial think tank. We're focused on the impact of energy transition to a low carbon economy for capital markets, the involved companies, and also their investors. We focused on identifying and quantifying stranded asset risk, a concept we developed a little more than 10 years ago, and we have our 10-year anniversary, which you will probably see more about in the coming months here. We really came from an area where my colleagues back then will really focus on a lot of the climate science, political ambition. We had all the way back to Kyoto, we have the Rio Agreement, we had the Copenhagen Agreement. All of these agreements on the political side, climate science side, we're very focusing on limiting global warming, limiting carbon emissions. But we, as Carbon Tracker, basically all our employees are formally workers in either City of London, Wall Street, from financial services. And that was not really the day we are recognizing when we are looking at our daily work, where we are basically daily being pitched for ever expanding production of oil, gas, and coal by different companies, which really led us to ask a very simple question: can we burn them all? We looked around and nobody had really done that analysis, so therefore we started to do that. So if you can go to the next slide. So the spoiler alert is no, we cannot burn them all. In fact, we found that there is probably around 5 to 6 times more emissions embedded in already discovered proven reserves of oil, gas, and coal than we can ever emit if we want to stay within these temperature targets that climate scientists have told us that we should try and stay within without having the very, very catastrophic impacts on the planet we all inhabit. Climate science shows that there is a finite limit on carbon emissions for any global warming outcome. That is defined as a carbon budget, but there are far more fossil fuels available than fits within these limits. Therefore, basic economics will have the higher cost of assets, run the biggest risk of not having to be or will not be extracted, at least not profitable. That creates that destroys value for the owners of these assets, which primarily are publicly listed companies, because they typically lease and get production licenses from state-owned companies, and that leads to stranded assets and losses, and that is what we overall are calling the carbon bubble. And we came up with this research about 10 years ago. Very little have done. Actually, emissions have increased on an annual basis, except from 2020 because of COVID. But we continue to emit more, whereas we continue to eat into the remaining budget or carbon budget. So if you want to stay within the 1.5 degree Celsius temperature rise or 2.7 Fahrenheit, I think it's always better to mention these things here in the US in Fahrenheit, because it's a higher degree number we can better relate to. But that basically means that we have less than 10 years of continued production as we are doing now, if we have to limit our temperature rise to around this 1.5 degree. How will this impact the global energy system, where we today are getting 80 to 85% of our energy from fossil fuel sources? If you go to the next slide, we can see this illustrated in another way, which is really comparing the different pathways towards meeting the Paris Agreement's ambitions of keeping us below 2 degrees Celsius temperature rise, with the ambition of staying no more than 1.5 degrees. And then that's the red and the blue shaded areas are really different scenarios to how we should get there. But we can see the lines from Exxon, BP, and Shell are really highlighting what the oil and gas companies are actually planning to do. So they're planning for continued growth, therefore widening the gap and creating more stranded assets. And just as a note, we mentioned 2020. Actually, because of the big impact on prices, people had to recalibrate their price expectations for future oil and gas prices. The oil and gas industry globally have actually written off almost $170 billion worth of assets when they have recalibrated their price expectations. For you as investors, that's another thing that's important to note here. Some other research that the Carbon Tracker have published. We have found, by going through the proxy statements and incentive packages of publicly listed companies, 9 out of 10 CEOs of oil and gas companies their bonuses are directly linked to increasing production and or the reserve base of the companies, i.e. the future production. That means that investors are currently paying companies to continue to grow production, whereas everything we have been through here really should indicate that production should be held back and should be curbed and reversed. So if we go to the next slide to say, where are we then now? So this here is a slide showing the primary energy demand globally on different energy sources. So the bad news, if we start by that, so although carbon emissions overall fell 6% in year 2020 because of COVID, Then it has quickly recovered, and actually if you look month by month, December 2020 had 2% higher carbon emissions than December 2019, according to the IEA. But in order to get to the ambitions from Paris Agreement and climate scientists, what they have laid out, meaning a 50% reduction in carbon emission in 10 years, 10 to 15 years, depending on 1.5 or 2 degree temperature rise, means we really need to have a COVID magnitude shock to the production and emissions on an annual basis, but without emissions recovering afterwards. So all of this here sounds difficult and complicated, but there are also some good news. There's a rapid energy technology innovation is happening, driven by energy disruption due to lower cost of renewables, wind and solar and batteries. Solar and battery costs have come down some 90% over the last decades. Wind power energy prices have come down some 60%. And this is something that Ron will cover later in his presentations. We also have some new political wins. US has rejoined the Paris Agreement. We have more than 70% of global GDP, including US, China, EU, UK, Japan, South Korea, have made pledges to reach net zero emissions by 2050 or 2060 in China's example, which definitely increases the likelihood of supportive policy responses on a global basis. Some forecasters here, we have DNV, which is a Norwegian energy consultancy, really has said that we probably saw overall peak global oil demand in 2019, and we have seen probably peak gasoline car sales in 2017. Even GM, General Motors, not really known to be a first adopter, have decided and announced that they will no longer sell gasoline cars by 2035. And they've even launched an electric version of the Hummer, which probably should indicate which direction things are going. So although 2020 was a bad year for most industries, it was a very good year for renewable energy. And globally, installations grew by more than 10%, 260 gigawatt of capacity, and more than doubling from the 2019 level. And as the world increasingly electrifies, we can electrify transportation, production, etc. We are seeing an ever increasing share of primary energy demand will come from renewable sources. Global primary energy demand is growing only about 1% per year. We have energy efficiencies and other things that comes into that. So there is not a direct one-to-one link between global GDP and energy demand. But with with renewable sources growing 10 to 20% per year over the last decade, they're increasingly taking over the growth away from fossil fuels, first from coal, then from oil, and then lastly from gas. And that means that we are very close, if not already near or at the peak fossil fuel demand. And this is where investors really need to pay attention. If you go to the next slide. Because it was one thing that is important to remember, investors lose money at or near the peak, not when the market has changed. A lot of you probably remember Nokia. That was once the leading mobile handset producer in the world. In 2007, when Apple launched their iPhone, Nokia had a market value of $150 billion. 2 years later, in 2009, after the rest of the market had rebounded from the financial crisis, Nokia was valued below 50 billion, and today only around 23 billion. Its share price collapsed far earlier than Apple's iPhone sales had overtaken Nokia's handset sales, either in volume or dollar terms. And the key reason for this is really that they continue to expand people's people's demands, taste, etc. are changing. That's also what we will see in the oil and gas sector. Incumbents continue to expect and build for growth. They continue to expand their capacity. They look for new revenue sources and production sources, but demand is increasingly taken over by newcomers like renewable energies, which have new, better technologies, typically lower cost, and therefore incumbents start to lose volumes. This means that the overall industry creates more and more overcapacity. That means prices are going to be downward pressure to everyone. And that leads to increasingly underutilized assets and stranded assets. So to sum up, lower volumes and lower prices means that we will have lower profitability, markets do not want to pay the same for lower profitability, therefore valuations decline. And this is really why the financial markets react much faster than we actually see the big changes happening in the market. They are looking at the anticipation of what's going to happen. And one of the best illustrations is really if you look at the energy sector in S&P 500, that in 2010 was around 15% weight of the whole S&P 500 index to now 3.5%. So last slide to sum it up. If you can see that, here we go. Energy transition creates a lot of risk and opportunities, both for companies, markets, and especially also for investors. The challenge, as you can see on the right-hand side, is we have built up a massive energy system over the last 200 years that need to be changed with accelerated depreciations, write-downs, new business models emerging, and all this is something we'll probably discuss during the Q&A. At Carbon Tracker, we have made an assessment that the asset value of the fossil fuel system, both demand and supply side, is worth more than $30 trillion that really need to be replaced by lower carbon technologies, and existing infrastructure, etc., need to be phased out. This will have an impact on your portfolios, and not only for the fossil fuel producers, but also all the surrounding industries. I think I'll stop here and hand it over to Ron, who will tell us more about how we can actually achieve this energy transition. Thanks a lot, and look forward to your questions.
All right, well, great to be here. If you could go over to my slide, that'd be great. First of all, I want to thank Chris at FFI and all the folks at IEN for hosting today's webinar for what couldn't be a more timely topic. I've personally gone through 3 different technology waves, first in telecom, then in the internet, and now for the last 2 decades in clean tech. And I think for me, one of the nice things about working in such emerging areas, and now one that's mainstream, in all 3 cases, they became mainstream industries, is the innovation that occurs. So hopefully over the next 8 minutes or so, I'll be able to express some of the innovation we're tracking. In 8 minutes, it's nearly impossible to discuss the magnitude of the current energy transition, but I did want to quickly walk everyone through 8 different graphics, so for 8 minutes, to sort of demonstrate the dynamism and scale of the shift we're experiencing. So this first slide is just to give you an idea of how we define the clean energy sector. I think it's important. Sometimes people just think renewable energy, and obviously we track the renewable sectors, including both the manufacturers of solar and wind, et cetera, and also the deployers, the developers. But we're also looking at things like energy storage and conversion, which includes energy storage, the EV manufacturers, and things like EV charging networks. We track energy intelligence and grid infrastructure. That includes things like smart meters, power management, et cetera. And then, of course, the enabling materials. And one thing that I would say about enabling materials and just these technologies in general is that in the future, really from now, the energy battles of the globe will not be over oil and gas deposits, but the enabling materials and the emerging technologies driving the energy transition. So next slide, please. So we see 5 major drivers that are at the forefront of the transition that we're starting to talk about, which we'll delve into more during the Q&A. But by far, the biggest shift is the pure economics. And Henrik already sort of overviewed a bit of that. I'll do a little bit more here just to show you some of the sources that we use to track that. But the declining costs that have made solar and wind power now more attractive from an economic standpoint than coal, nuclear, and even natural gas in a growing number of global markets for new capacity additions. So for me, that's the biggest kahuna. It's the pure economics. We're also seeing an investment shift. It's partly what we're talking about today, but there's this huge shift moving from fossil fuels to clean energy, even among some of the entrenched players. So while not yet complete and still very much in its early stages, for the first time, we're seeing investments in the energy transition that last year, according to Bloomberg NEF, broke the 500 billion or half a trillion mark for the first time. So this can't be understated, the importance of the shift in capital markets. And then, of course, there's the public policy and public support. And Henrik also mentioned some of the low carbon policies that we're starting to see emerge in Europe, Asia, the United States now with Biden administration in charge. And that's driving an incredible amount of activity as well as just general public support. The final driver that I think is pretty important is the electrification of energy markets and the rise of the smart grid. And I'll talk a little bit about that more in some further slides. So obviously, this is a very high level view, but I think it provides a pretty good context for both for the tech, policy and capital innovation occurring today in the thematic sectors of clean energy and grid. Next slide, please. So as you can see in this next slide, if anyone's not seen the Lazard analysis that they've been putting out now for more than a decade, I recommend you take a look. And they show that on a levelized cost basis, unsubsidized, utility scale solar and onshore wind have seen the greatest decline in costs compared to other energy sectors. So again, this was briefly mentioned, but just if you look at the bottom right of the slide, you see that solar and wind are now coming in at around $40 per megawatt hour. That equates to 4 cents per kilowatt hour. So unprecedented in the history of energy to see this type of cost. Onshore wind costs are down 70%. Crystalline PV costs are down 89% in this period tracked. And if you look at this, not surprising perhaps, but very important to note, coal and nuclear costs are both up during the same time period. And I think what's happening here is that as technology-centric energy sources with no cost for their fuel sources, solar and wind are seeing economies of scale more akin to the chip industry and high-tech industries than the traditional energy sectors. So they act much more like tech because they are. And that was one of the reasons we came up with the concept of clean tech more than 2 decades ago when we launched Clean Edge. Finally, Lazard's analysis finds that solar and wind are now the most cost competitive sources of new electricity. And that's backed up by the IEA data. If you didn't see it, it came out late last year, showing that solar is now the cheapest form of electricity for utility companies to build and the cheapest in the history of the tracking of electricity costs. So a huge shift occurring. So if we go to the next slide, the thing that's interesting, obviously, energy storage is the holy grail to enabling the energy transition. I don't know if you go to the next slide, if that's possible. The renewable sources are obviously key to this. We need the zero carbon, low carbon source of energy, but they're also intermittent. They have variability. So we need energy storage. That's the linchpin. It's the big kahuna. It's critical. But what we're seeing is that energy storage is exhibiting now cost declines similar to what we witnessed in the solar industry. So it's down 89% between 2010 and 2020. So very much of these price experience curves that we see in other technologies. And on the back of this significant reduction in costs, 2020, and this was mentioned earlier, during a global pandemic, was a milestone year for US energy storage deployment, with more than 1 gigawatt deployed at about 1.5 billion in capital investments. So this reduction in costs and this mass deployment, I think we're just going to see an incredible amount of activity. If solar was the last decade and now offshore wind, energy storage is where we're going to see incredible amount of activity moving forward. So next slide, please. So Bloomberg has been tracking investments for quite some time. They recently updated, this is Bloomberg New Energy Finance, NEF, and they've recently added in some other sectors to go just beyond renewables. So, you know, in the past decade or so, the majority of investments were in solar and wind, but we're now starting to see growth in electrified transportation and, as I mentioned, energy storage, both distributed and utility scale, including enabling materials such as lithium. And I think the Bloomberg numbers, which have been so important, the other is the future casting that they do. And they're seeing that renewable energy sources are set to present or represent about 3/4 of the 10.2 trillion the world will need to invest in new power generating technology through 2040. So just to give you a sense of the size of these markets. Next slide, please. So what does this shift to solar, wind, and storage mean? Well, one need look no further than the past decade in the US. And we'll talk globally as well. But this is, we're putting out monthly data dives at CleanEdge as part of our research output. And if you look at this slide, you can see that in 2020, on the far right, renewables represented more than 3/4 of all capacity additions. Wind contributed 47%, utility scale solar, this is just utility scale, 30%, both outpacing natural gas for the first time. In 2010, the story is pretty much reversed, with renewables, mainly wind, representing 28% of capacity additions, and natural gas and coal contributing 70%. So between 2010 and 2020, the US added an average of 24.7 gigawatts of capacity annually, and you can see the split up here. So pretty impressive to see that. And globally, the picture is very similar. IRENA, which is the International Renewable Energy Agency, recently reported that the world added, I think Henrik actually mentioned this, to 260 gigawatts of RE capacity. That represented 80% of all new electricity capacity added last year, again, during a global pandemic. And then the next slide, please. So the other thing is that this rapid expansion doesn't happen equally everywhere. But what's interesting is to look at the top 10 renewable energy states. This is another research we just put out. We used to track all the top 50 metros and all 50 states on their clean tech activities in a leadership index that we produced at CleanEdge. And one of the most popular slides we created and data points was this comparison between a 10-year period. So if you can advance the slide just one. So this shows you in 2020 the representation of the in-state electricity generation for the top 10 states. And the prior one shows you from 2010. So you can see the significant growth. You can see that it's not just wind, it's also solar. In this case, you know, it's important to realize that you've got one state, Iowa, at first time ever, more than 50% of their in-state generation coming from renewables. And you've got 6 states for the first time getting 30% or more. Again, this is generation, not capacity. So this is the actual electrons generated in the state. So some historic numbers happening here. And I think the thing that I really want to point out in this, because I think the public piece of this is critical, is that this is an equal divide between red and blue states. So I want to encourage us, you know, at the federal level, often it can be a little discouraging, but at the state level, you have governors on both the red and the blue aisles supporting the transition, and just shows that with this equal divide. And then my final slide before I pass it back over to Mike. I want to just briefly talk about the grid of the future, because for me, this is close to heart. I spent years, I mean, I think I was one of the first 2,000 people probably to see the World Wide Web and navigate the internet, because I was kind of seeing that in '92. It was very early days. And so for me, thinking about the internet and the grid, this lesson is pretty important in terms of the transition we need to make in enabling a grid of the future. This isn't a perfect diagram here, but it shows we're going from a one-way flow of electrons to bidirectional. It's showing people not just being consumers of energy, but being consumers and producers. I think some people like to call it prosumers. It shows moving from a spoke and wheel kind of command and control network to a nodal network. And I believe that this digitization and decentralization is a very important thing to look at. It includes a lot of energy storage. It includes a lot of EV charging. So we can talk about it more later, but this grid of the future, you know, one thing I'll end here, if you brought Edison back, it'd be amazing. He could look at today's grid and go, yeah, I kind of get it. And imagine bringing back the early mainframe computer engineers and showing them an iPhone or an iPad. I think they'd be pretty wowed. So the amount of progress has been slow. And I think over the next 2 to 3 decades, one of the big areas of activity will be bringing the grid into the 21st century. So with that, I want to pass it back over to FFI, and Mike is going to do an overview of more of the energy transition and the investment landscape.
Great. Thanks, Ron. And thank you for the IEN for hosting. What I'm going to try to do here is just take what Henrik and Ron just talked about and focus on asset owners and really how they're dealing with all this information, and really great, insightful information. Thanks, guys. And, and really what a difference a year makes. Prior to 2020, companies across all industries were starting to confront the issue of climate change. They've been rethinking their businesses and how to meet the challenges of aligning with the Paris Agreement. And some, just some, started to make some net zero commitments. But over the past, 12 to 18 months, particularly where asset owners are concerned, net zero has shifted from being a North Star to almost a bulldozer for climate action. I mean, any conversation that we have with university endowments will ultimately come down to net zero. And it really is a major transition driver now. So rather than simply looking to companies to deliver a net zero future, asset owners are focusing on assessing their own actions and mandates, and they're evaluating their portfolio's exposure and impact so they themselves can reach net zero. But most importantly, they're making investment decisions based on a company's commitment and progress towards net zero. So with all that said, the tactics haven't changed, and asset owners invest or not, across this spectrum of net zero. Next slide, please. I'm sorry, I was a slide behind, but that was my slide there. I apologize. Moving on to the next slide. So let's look at that spectrum, the first two components of it, the engagement versus the exclusions. 6 or 7 years ago, the question was, should I engage or should I exclude? And today these aren't mutually exclusive. Asset owners, both individually and collectively, are demanding more detailed information. They're demanding demonstrated action from the companies they invest in, and investors are applying both of these strategies to extract value and to make a difference. So, we at FFI, we've been in the screening business for a long time. As Chris mentioned up front, we're known for our fossil fuel reserves emissions-based screen, the Carbon Underground 200. Well, the tenor's really changed when it comes to screening, and fossil fuel companies are not all the same. And as Henrik mentioned, some are more exposed to transition risks than others. And some have committed to net zero and are transitioning, and they will play a significant role in this transition. So asset owners are saying to us now, we have these conversations all the time, don't tell us who to exclude, tell us who's committed to the net zero, tell us who's best positioned to succeed in the transition, and tell us who we should invest in ultimately. And so we've even had to transform our own business, just to do just this. Next slide, please. So really, there's no turning back when it comes to ESG. That train has left the station, and ESG will ultimately become ubiquitous. However, there's so many ESG, rating systems out there. There's a zillion factors, and there's just so many investment products. So it really does come down to doing your research and buyer beware. Because if you think you're protected by ESG, you really need to look hard and think again. Many of these ratings are simply check the box. And it's really interesting that so many strategies include, material allocations to fossil fuels and not to clean energy. And what it really comes down to is that the ESG scores of clean energy companies and fossil fuel companies may not be materially different. Now, on the impact side, this is sort of the nexus between ESG and divestment. Allocating capital in companies and in structures, that deliver social and climate impact as well as performance, it really is the future, and it's just a big budding area for everybody right now. Next slide, please. So when it comes to transitioning, we sort of come full circle. How do you transition a portfolio to net zero? What it comes down to, there is no right or wrong. It really is a matter of assessing what you own, understanding the impact of what you currently own. And then the harder part, it really is determining your goals, in alignment with all of your stakeholders. And that's a big lift, and we help out in this area too. But ultimately, what you have to do then is just choose the tools, the tactics, and determine your pathway to get there. And in the end, this is really the whole process, and it does take quite a bit of energy. And we at FFI, this is what we do, and enjoy working with all of the asset owners and asset managers on this front. So I'll close with that, and I'll bring it back to Chris.
Okay, great. Thanks so much, Mike, and thanks, Ron and Henrik, for the time you spent preparing your presentations. I think there's a lot of good information here in terms of trends in the sectors, and Mike gave some good insights in terms of how investors are starting to respond. So let me just ask the panelists a few questions. A couple of questions came in just now, and I will try to incorporate those actually in the questions to the panelists. So one in particular came in from Charles, and I'm going to try to paraphrase it a little bit because it's a question that also came in from others in the registration. So maybe I'll direct it to Henrik first, and then Ron and Mike, please feel free. But we've heard a lot and seen a lot of communications from the oil and gas companies, particularly the majors, that they're committed to being part of the solution, right? But yet, Henrik, you talked about the carbon budget, the compensation practices that reward production. There seems to be a gap here. So what's the likelihood that the existing majors are going to effectively transition and become clean energy companies, or basically become investable by ESG investors? If you could give some thoughts on that.
Yeah, that's obviously one of the key questions when we come to focus on the investors. Sorry, on the companies, like what can you invest in? If they don't do something, when should you sell them? Does it work to sell them, or what happened here? I think one of the key things when we look at the different companies is that talk is cheap. I think it's the saying, but it's very easy to come out with big bold press releases and glossy magazines and reports and so on. But as long as the companies continue to allocate 95% of their capex and their future investments into continuing producing oil and gas and coal, it's very hard to see that they have any realistic change of plan to get away from the current path that they are on. I think it's really a matter of the companies need to make a strategic decision on which direction they want to go. That's not clear what is the best way. It also depends on the companies, what assets they have, where they're located, the jurisdictions, etc. they operate in. But you can really boil them into two, maybe three categories. One is a harvest strategy of, well, we are going to be the lowest cost producer, and then we can make sure that we can produce as cheap as possible, and then we can maybe continue as long as possible. There's people who can focus on, well, we want to be an energy company rather than an oil and gas or coal company. Total, the French company, is changing name to Total Energies to reflect that they are trying to get into producing also electricities. That requires a lot of investments and a lot of strategic thinking and changing that array around. And then, I don't know, there might be some things in between these two spectrums, and maybe there's another way of coming here, but it's important to select. Ørsted, which is the utility company from my native Denmark, where I'm originally from, formerly known as Danish Oil and Natural Gas Energy Company, were very big in exploration of oil and gas in the North Sea, and they have their old coal plants, etc. But now that's a poster child for an energy transition. I think that's all fine and great, but I think it's important that investors actually pay attention that Ørsted they started developing their offshore wind development skills back in 2002. That's 20 years ago. They decided in 2010 that they are going to go the route of being focused on offshore development after they had a failed IPO attempt back just around the time of the financial crisis. And it's not until now, 10 years later, that they're really into this area. You can see NextEra in the US has also gone that direction. Actually, they were briefly bigger than Exxon last year, when there was very little focus on oil and gas and more focus on renewables. But it requires that companies are taking the strategic direction and then map out and tell investors how they're going to get there. I think that's probably the key thing. So can you invest in these companies? Well, they should map out and say how are they going to get there.
Okay. Ron, do you want to?
Yeah, it's a fascinating question. And Henrik did such a good job. He mentioned a lot of the companies I was going to invoke. And I think for me, I'm less optimistic for the big oil extraction focused companies. I think the European majors are doing a much better job, obviously, than the US majors. But I do look to the energy companies, an Ørsted, a NextEra, an NG, an NL. These are companies that really could be a significant part of the transition. And as Henrik said, I mean, if you look at Dong to Ørsted and taking their offshore capabilities and putting it towards not petroleum extraction, but to offshore wind. The other thing is, I would say that the problem with some of the big oil players is that because of their entrenched interests and because they've dealt more with extraction and refining, I'm actually more optimistic for maybe the auto manufacturers because they're very technology centric. So they have the capacity to make things. So that's kind of a little bit of the difference. It's difficult to unpack all of this, but if I had a betting man, I'd just say, the oil companies, if they really commit and they commit to transition and they do all the investments that are required, like you see a Total and a Shell trying to do, they may be participants. I'm a little more optimistic for the large energy players who have shown that they can, participate. And certainly anyone who makes things like the auto manufacturers, I think is maybe a somewhat better position to participate.
Yeah.
But it's like, at the end of the day, I'll wrap up with this. If you go to our website, you can look at a data dive that we put back out in 4 months ago, comparing the oil majors market caps to the clean energy major market caps, including NextEra and Ørsted. And Ian, I just checked this before we got on, or while we were talking. Tesla today, their market cap is 688 billion, compared to Exxon's 233 billion. So the shift that occurred over the last, we tracked 2-year period from the end of 2018 to the end of 2020, even today. I mean, that's unheard of. So Tesla rapidly expanded. It's a pretty large market cap. We all know that. Exxon sort of cratered. So, and then you look at NextEra today, right now, minutes ago, they're at 158.37 billion and Chevron 194.73. So kind of getting close. They're going to go back and forth a little bit, but market caps could be an interesting way to sort of look, and we'll keep updating those annually just to see what the market's looking like.
Yep. Good. And, I think that's all consistent too with some of the things that we are seeing, and Mike pointed those out earlier in terms of, investors really beginning to dig down because all these oil and gas companies are not the same, right? And some are better positioned for the transition than others, and firms like ours are all, collectively ours are working to give some information to investors to enable them to make that decision. So yeah, definitely see the trend. So one question that just came in, I do want to try to get to as many of the audience questions. And Ron, I'm going to try to paraphrase this one as well. When we talk about the, you talk about the different sectors within clean energy, certainly broader today than it was, let's say, and more mature than it was 10 to 15 years ago. But,
Sure.
A lot of times we'll get questions, well, is it an either or? Should we be, who's going to win, solar or wind, right? What kind of battery, what kind of storage technology is going to win out in the end? Is it going to be solid state? Is it going to be lithium ion still? And one question came in just now about, how should we think about low carbon technologies such as carbon capture and storage, utilization and storage, hydrogen. Can you just sort of comment on maybe the I don't know, competition is not the right word, but
yeah, sure. I
between
mean,
the sectors.
you're right. Well, first of all, obviously there's been a huge shift. We launched our first index now 15 or so years ago, and what we tracked then and what we track today has changed. The markets have progressed, and so yield codes didn't exist. The EV market was barely, was venture funded at the time, not public company. So obviously shifts there. But I would say this, I think for me, the biggest shift that's occurring is that these technologies are going from sitting in silos to converging. And that's sort of like the systems integration that we saw with the internet as well. And so to me, it's not either or, it's definitely a both and. It's all of the above within the clean energy sectors if we're going to try to transition. And some will be winners and some will not. But the big shift is going to be this mashup of technology. So just a quick example, solar used to sit in a silo, wind was in a silo. Now you've got solar and wind being paired up with energy storage to create a totally different development. And that's what we're going to see more of. It's the same thing with offshore wind. A great example, taking the offshore the turbines are getting larger and larger and larger. You all have seen that. And then pairing that up with offshore petroleum platform technology, and you've got offshore wind. And so it's and then another one would be like EV, 5G, and charging infrastructure, and maybe autonomy. So I don't think it's an either or, it's all of the above.
Yeah.
In terms of carbon capture and sequestration, I would prefer to see carbon capture, sequestration, and utilization. I think that starts to get pretty interesting. Can you make concrete out of carbon emissions? I think the pipe dream of just storing that carbon underground is not as interesting to me. And I think it just enables the current fossil fuel infrastructure, and it's years off. And if they've been talking about it for decades, it's very complex to really put that underground and keep it there. But utilization is interesting. So yeah, there's a lot of different technologies here. This is what I get to do all day long. So I'm tracking all the technologies. It's exciting. In the battery space, yeah, there's solid state, there's competitors to lithium. We still have, pumped hydro. So we're going to do all of those different things. The markets will tell us which ones make the most sense. We need to open up the capital markets for these investments. We're seeing that happen. And I think post with the rebuild after COVID, there's going to be a lot of innovation occurring in those realms across the globe.
Yeah. Henrik, maybe if you could just quickly comment on carbon capture as well.
I think carbon capture is an interesting area. If it works, great, but people need to invest in it, and they need to take this serious. And I think the scary part is the scenarios and everything we talked about already assume commercially scaled CCS or CCUS being implemented in less than a decade's time. Nobody's really investing in it. Are we going to get anywhere without a price on actual carbon? It doesn't cost anything to do the carbon emission, so why should people pay and create a business model? How can you create a business model by removing all of these things? Just for reference, I think we have 25 commercially scaled plants that can remove around 40 megatons or 40 tons a year. We emit more than 40 gigatons, so we are removing currently 0.01% of carbon. So in 10 years' time, according to the scenarios, we're going to remove almost a gigaton. So we have to invest 5, 6, 7, 8 plants a week from the next 30, 40 years. And that costs a lot of money, but it's already assumed in how people's carbon and climate models are built out. That, I think, is actually probably the most scary part.
Yep. Okay. So I'm going to try to get to some of these audience questions here. And if you guys could try to answer quickly so I can sort of get through them. Ron, I think this one is more for you. If you could maybe talk a little bit more on sort of what's driving down the costs of wind and solar, sort of going back to the levelized cost. There was a question that came in about, economies of scale or competition. Can you maybe just comment?
Sure.
On that
so
quick?
There's an embedded price experience curve in all these technologies. For solar, it's pretty much been about a 20% decline for every doubling of manufacturing output globally. So it's the manufacturing. It's this technologies do that, right? Like chips, they get cheaper to make and they become more powerful. And batteries will do the same thing. They'll become more dense and they'll charge more rapidly and they'll cost less. And you'll use less materials. So because they're technology driven, here in Oregon, we've had a lot of chip manufacturers. I wouldn't be surprised if we start to see energy storage manufacturing. You've got embedded technology capacity engineers that can do this. And so that's part of it. And the other is, I think I wouldn't underestimate renewable portfolio standards or clean energy standards in driving all of this. That's probably been the most effective policy tool on the renewable energy side. And so you've got states like California, Hawaii, you've got nations, Denmark and others, with various levels of RPS or clean energy standards. I think it's very possible we'll hear something from Biden during Earth Day. Maybe it'll come later, but a national clean energy standard would go a long way in the US. So we'll see what comes out. But I think it's about the technology. And then it is, obviously, we talked policy, tech, capital, but on the policy side, those clean energy standards do quite a bit.
Okay, thank you. And then maybe one last one for Mike, even because we're running out of time and there are going to be questions that we're just not going to be able to address, but we'll try to respond after the webinar to all of them. But some questions came in advance, and I'm just going to paraphrase them here to Mike, maybe with one simple question to you, which is, what does it mean to have an investment portfolio that is aligned with the energy transition? I know that may be a loaded question. You could probably go on for 10 or 15 minutes about that, but maybe in 90 seconds, if you could just give your thoughts on that.
Thanks. Well, net zero, this is more of a philosophy of how to get there, and there's no real standards yet. We're working on these standards, but it's still a ways off. So really, I think what it comes down to is, first, for any asset owners, just a signal intent. So we're going to do this, and this is how we're going to do it, and being transparent. And we spend a lot of time actually, helping asset owners just on the reporting aspect, so they can be transparent with their stakeholders. And then you have to recognize the risk and the opportunity. So you have to know what you have, and then analyze those for where the risks and opportunities are. And then as I think I said in my talk, is you have to spend the time developing that policy and how to get there, and really just start to implement the metrics you want to measure. So you have, and then you also have to adjust with those as standards emerge. So there's just a lot of ways to go about this. You can obviously cut back on fossil fuel reserve emissions that are in your portfolio. You can do tilts, and you can tilt towards companies that have better scope emissions, that are actually doing the reporting. And then you just sort of move your exposure away from the dirty and into the clean, and all the stuff that Henrik and Ron have brought into the picture. You just take that, and again, you've got to just do this at both a policy level and through your external managers and consultants.
Yeah. Thanks. So I think we're running up against our hour time limit, and there are a handful of questions that I would love to delve into. There's one from Tim about carbon offsets and our views on carbon offsets. Maybe we can relay some information back to you on email on that. I just don't think we're going to be able to get around due to time, but maybe I could just give some quick closing thoughts here in the next 30 seconds if folks can stay around. I think this net zero is a really, really important concept, as Mike had mentioned, and right now it is certainly more of a philosophy than a standard. It's going to be, at this point, challenging to measure per se, because what you're really doing is you're relying on behavior in the future, and mostly corporate behavior, to determine whether or not your portfolio is aligned with net zero. And I guess my advice would be not to let the perfect get in the way of the good. Because those investors who are out front and can put some strategies in place, whether they're centered on shareholder engagement or screening out sectors, applying ESG or impact or all of the above, even if you may be frustrated with the lack of data and standards, I really do think there's enough there to get started because, going back to Henrik's presentation, we just don't have time. We don't have time to obtain perfect data or information or wait for somebody to set standards. That process is important, but I don't think we can, use that as a crutch for not taking action. And the last thing is that I think, we believe that profit and purpose are aligned. We've heard those arguments today that, hey, look, you have to transition off of fossil fuels for the health of the planet. And as Ron talked about, we think that, doing so for us, given the information and given the trends in clean energy, also present a great economic opportunity. So that's it. And thanks everybody for joining. And Hannah and Gladys, I don't know if you want to make any final comments, but enjoy Earth Day this Thursday, everyone.